All right, good morning. So, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the Canadian government and its structure and how power flows from the people. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the first past the post system because sometimes people get that a little bit mixed up. And so, I'm going to make it as simple as possible. So, if you look behind me, you will notice there's three. This is the federal government, and that's what I'm going to focus on. Now, please note we have three levels of government. We have the federal government, which is all of Canada. We have provincial or territorial governments. And lastly, we have municipal governments. Some of you may live in the MD, so you're structured a little bit different than in a town and council. Some of you may live on a reserve, and so you will have chief and council, so there are differences there. Today, we're going to focus mostly on the federal government. Okay, so with the federal government, there are three different branches, which you'll be reading about. The first is the legislative, next is executive, and next is judicial. Now, here's how I remember them. L for laws, so this is the branch that makes laws. E for enforcing, and I want you to think of the term executive as well. If you have the basic suite in a hotel or the executive suite, which sounds higher up. So the executive, and you'll see how that's a bit of a step up in a moment. And lastly is the judicial branch, or the J for judges. Okay, so they interpret the laws. So we have the legislative that makes the laws, the executive that enforces the laws, and then the judicial, whose job is to interpret the laws. And this goes back to some of your readings earlier. Montesquieu, coming out of around the time of the French and American revolutions, he said that we needed a separation of powers because, of course, the power was all in the hands of the king, and he was the judge, the jury, and they used to use the term executioner. In your studies of Adolf Hitler, that's exactly what he did with the Enabling Acts of 1933. He took all three of these and put them together into one. So he became the Fuhrer, the unchecked supreme leader. Whereas in a true democracy, you have to have a separation of power. And ultimately, that power comes from the people. And that's what democracy means. The people rule, or power from the people. So if we start down here with voters. Now, to be a voter, you must be a Canadian citizen and 18 years of age. Just living in Canada is not enough. In 2010, my family and I, we spent a year in Australia. I taught over there. There was a federal election over there. I was not allowed to vote there. Okay, because I'm not an Aussie citizen. However, I was protected under all their other democratic rights. Just like anyone that comes to Canada, they are entitled to all of those rights and protections and securities as well. However, not when it comes to democracy. You must be a sworn-in Canadian citizen, so 18 plus. Now, what ends up happening, and I can send a map out or you can Google it, is they take the country and they divide it up by population. And so you might be able to see this in the top corner. There are 338 ridings or constituencies across the entire country. Of those 338 seats, Alberta gets 34. Ontario gets 121. And so we often hear Alberta has no say, we have no power. Yes and no. Okay, PEI has 4 seats because PEI has about 120,000 people in it. Alberta has about 4 million. Ontario has about 12 million. So it's based on population. So when you look at the federal ridings, they carve up the country into these different constituencies or ridings based on population. Some of them physically are very large, some of them are small. Most of you live in the Macleod riding. So that runs from Crow's Nest over towards Lethbridge up to Natin area. So we get to elect one person to send to Ottawa to represent us. Whereas Calgary has around 12 ridings because Calgary has over 1 million people. Claresholm, Pincher Creek, Macleod, these are all little towns that run about 4,000 people or so. And so it's a large geographical riding, and together it makes up a population of 80 to 100,000. That's usually the guideline. So they divide it up based on population. So in each riding or constituency, main parties will try to run a candidate. A candidate is someone who's trying to become an MP, a member of parliament. And so you have different parties, the voters have different parties. And then eventually, these parties, now, Wild Rose doesn't exist. It may make a comeback. The UCP, those are provincial parties. They are not federal parties. We're talking the federal branch here now. I can teach you provincial after we're done this in literally 30 seconds. Okay? All these different parties. So your main ones, of course, are your Conservative, not UCP, again, your Liberal, and your NDP. Those are your main political parties. You can also throw the Green in there. They did successful a couple elections ago. They had about 10% of the popular vote, which we're going to learn about today. But overall, they only got 1 or 2 seats elected. After you see your campaigns and everything else, the voters pick the person with the most, or whoever gets the most votes ends up becoming the MP, the Member of Parliament. They then go off to Ottawa to represent us. And they go to this, the House of Commons. That's a bad house there. Okay, there's 338 MPs, and they sit in our parliament. It's a nice little building, looks a little bit similar to the one in London. And this is where you see on TV, this is where Justin Trudeau and all the other people are. Justin Trudeau has to run as an MP in one of the 338 ridings. I can't remember what his riding is. I think it's in Quebec somewhere. I don't even remember. Stephen Harper, former prime minister before Justin Trudeau, he was the MP for Calgary Southwest. So he was one of those 10 or 12 people, MPs for the Calgary people. And it just so happened that he became prime minister as well. And here's how that works. Before they go into an election, each political party decides who their leader is. The Conservatives have a new leader, Erin O'Toole. Erin O'Toole is an MP in a riding in Ontario somewhere. If he is elected and his party gets the most seats in the next federal election, he then gets sworn in as prime minister. So what they do is they all know who the leaders are of the different parties. Eventually, they get the seat count and they look and go, okay, this party has the most seats. Who's your leader? We know who it is. Okay, guess what? You get to sit in a special chair. You are now prime minister. And so what ends up happening is you get to go over here and you get to be part of the executive. So you are the prime minister. Now, note, the power still comes from the people, the voters. Erin O'Toole, Justin Trudeau and others, they have to run and they have to get into the House of Commons. They get elected in their riding first, then once in here, because the parties have decided and the voters, and you can join a political party at any time and vote on leadership in that, whoever their leader is becomes the prime minister. The first step, once you become prime minister, is you need to form a cabinet. Okay? A cabinet basically helps the prime minister oversee things. Now, there is no set number on the cabinet. It depends on how the prime minister arranges it. Usually it's anywhere from about 25 to 30 different ministries. And so the cabinet will consist of various areas. And these are based on the services that they provide to the public across all of Canada. So for example, you always have finance. They have to have a budget, and that's seen as the top dog position next to the prime minister. You will have resources, and they often combine that with fisheries. You will have justice, and that gets into specifics. You will have a postal service is federal. You will have defense. You will not have education because education is a provincial responsibility. However, we do have a federal healthcare minister, even though healthcare is a provincial responsibility, and that's to cover the Canada Health Act to ensure that all Canadians have a minimal standard. So you can go through and you can Google these portfolios change all the time. And so they look after different areas. Now, where does he get those cabinet ministers from? He goes and looks at his friends that are sitting over here. That's traditionally how it works. So what he'll do is he'll go over and say, okay, I need these different people to help me run the country. He's not going to pick Erin O'Toole. He doesn't like Erin O'Toole. If Erin O'Toole is in, he's not going to pick Justin Trudeau and so on. They pick people from their own party. So they grab MPs and they say, oh, I should draw that line a little bit straighter. And they say, you become my cabinet. And then he puts people into those positions. Okay, so that's how one becomes a cabinet minister. And then underneath, all of these form what's called the public service. I'll look at this one as an example. Now, what they will do is they will have someone that will become the Minister for Defense. Usually, most of these MPs are like lawyers and stuff like that, and they're not machine gun toting people not. Our current Minister of Defense has been described as a real legit badass because he actually has been in the military and has a pretty legit record with that. However, what you will have is you will have these ministers that maybe have no military experience, but underneath the public service, you will have generals and you will have a deputy minister and so on. And those are people that have the expertise in those areas. Okay. And they will pick people from time. So one of the finance minister previously, Monroe was his name. He was a big business guy and stuff like that. And then there were some scandals and stuff, and he walked away, and so on. You will get these different people looking after these different areas. Eventually, it forms the public service. Public service people do not have to run for election, even though they're part of the government. They have to provide the services to the voters, and it goes back like this. So at the provincial level, I am a public servant and you're getting this fine service message today. Okay. I don't have to run for campaign for my job. I don't, when the elections happen, that doesn't change my position. I have a position as a teacher, principal of Matthew Halton, and I am part of the public service. However, whoever the cabinet minister is, and this is at the provincial level, because you can relate to this example, obviously will have an effect on my job because they decide what curriculum we teach. They decide how much money we get and how much funding to education and all those other things. And if we go back to school or stay home, all those things. So public servants, they are responsible and they fall under this, but they're not part of the election process. Okay, other people and parts that are in here. So we're going to jump around a little bit. Next, we have to go over to the judiciary. Okay, and what the Prime Minister will do again is appoint Supreme Court judges. And so you have the Supreme Court of Canada. This consists of 9 judges. And then it goes down from here. Now, there's a whole hierarchy of the judicial system. You don't have to get into all of that. Within this 9 judges, there's a Chief Justice, and they basically are in charge. Notice the number is uneven, so when they go to a vote on something, you can never come up with a tie. Okay, then the Chief Justice gets involved and breaks the tie. Here's an interesting tidbit for you. Bev McLaughlin was early 2000s up until about 2010, I'm guessing. I don't know for sure. She was the Supreme Court of Canada, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. Basically, if Justin Trudeau passed a law and we didn't think it was constitutional and against our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and all that other stuff, she could look it over. The other judges could look it over and say, oh, no, you didn't, Justin. You're out of here. Little thing about Bev McLaughlin, if you're cruising around in Pinch Creek by the 7-Eleven someday, check out Bev McLaughlin Drive, because Bev McLaughlin is a graduate of Matthew Halton School, which is really cool. So if you grow up in a small rural community, you can go to the top of the food chain in the justice system. So it's no excuse if you go to a small rural school, and you can boss around the Prime Minister to some degree and hang out with George Bush and presidents and other cool people like that. Okay, although she hasn't hung out with me. So anyways, so that's the Supreme Court of Canada. These are different parts. There are other parts of the government as well. One of them is a high profile one, is the Governor General. We're going to put the GG in here. The GG's job is to do this. Okay, they are the Queen's representative in Canada. And so basically, when the president comes from the United States for a visit, it might be the governor general that goes out and meets them at the airport and gets in the car with them and chats with them. When there's certain ceremonies, they go out, they cut ribbons, they shake hands, they kiss the baby, they do things like that. So they are actually technically our head of state. And so when they actually pass laws, this person is involved, and I'll go over that in a moment. So they're part of the legislative and executive. If you had to pick between the two, put them under legislative. I'll explain that in a moment. Again, this is an appointed position. So we're starting to see a theme here. Appointed, that's an A, appointed, appointed. And guess what? There's another one, and Mr. Kenny's been fighting this, and Alberta's fought this for years. There's another section that's off the legislative, and this chart's getting a little bit messy now, and that's our Senate. There's like 105 of these people. So these people are put in based on appointments, and again, prime ministers, they'll always typically pick whoever, they'll pick Liberal friends or retired Senate, MPs and so on and so forth, or maybe people that gave them money somewhere along the line. So these people get appointed to the upper chamber of the House. Their job is to give a sober second look. That's a term that we actually use to describe the Senate. So what ends up happening is that the Senate actually looks over laws that are created, and then they either approve it or they say you need to rethink this, or it's unconstitutional, and so on. Typically what happens, and the term that describes the Senate often, is a rubber stamp. They look it over and go, yeah, we're good with that, and they send it on. That's not always the case, but it is. These are based on regional representation. Ontario gets 24, Quebec gets 24, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Western provinces get 6 each. What's 6 times 4, boys and girls? Well, it's 24. The Maritime provinces, or Atlantic Canada, is actually overrepresented. They get a total of 32, which is really weird, which is a third of the Senate, but yet they make up 10% of the population. But they were around before Alberta was Alberta, and I guess they got that little perk, and they are overrepresented. But the Senate, how much power does it really yield? Yeah, I don't know. Alberta, since the 1980s, has been pushing for a triple E Senate: elective, effective, and what the heck is the other part? Efficient. And so they wanted a system that where we could put the people in power. Oh, equal was the other one. Sorry, not. So they wanted people in power that they actually voted for. In the U.S., senators are 2 per state, and they are actually elected, and it's a little bit more power and carries a little bit more weight. Anyways, here's the overview of that. You've got the Governor General, you've got the Senate. There are certainly other parts to the government. We could draw a whole web just on the Prime Minister's office and the different pieces that work with the Prime Minister, but I think I've got all the main ones here. The important thing is to represent or show the power of the voters. Now, next, how a law gets passed, that could be a web. But very quickly, what ends up happening is that all the action happens in the House of Commons. A cabinet minister will stand up and say, I want to pass a, excuse me, they will do a law. A proposed law is called a bill. So they might stand up and say, I want to pass a bill that we will no longer mine coal in all of Canada. There's the first reading. They'll talk about it. Then the MPs will go out and they'll discuss it, and then the media gets involved and people start protesting or saying yay. Either way, they debate it, it gets out there, it circulates. They then do a second reading. We propose that, and they fine tune it a little bit. Eventually, they will do a third reading, and then they will vote on it. If the majority, and the majority is literally just 50% plus 1, pass it, and say, yes, we support that, then it becomes a law. Once it's done there, it then goes to the Senate. The Senate looks it over, and they usually go, yep, sounds good, rubber stamp it, and send it on. And then the Governor General makes it official, gives it royal assent. They sit there and they get their little feather pen and they sign off on it, and it becomes law. And then that may go to cabinet, and then it's up to others to enforce that to make sure that it passes. Okay, someone comes along and says that's unconstitutional. It's in the charter that I can burn coal. It actually isn't, but let's say there was a law that they passed that we believed went against our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. You could actually appeal it to the Supreme Court of Canada. And that's what the Supreme Court of Canada is. If me and Jed are hanging out in Pincher Creek and we're doing B&Es and we're stealing wheels off cars, we go to court, we don't end up in the Supreme Court of Canada. Supreme Court of Canada only deals with big cases, a couple of cases a year. So it's tied into the idea of really big things, constitutional challenges, and so on. The US system is a little bit different, but and Canada would be different. Controversial issues like the right to die. Okay, so assisted suicide, abortion, taking away voter or strikers' rights, and so on. So there have been unions such as teachers and nurses and others that have actually gone on strike. And under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it talks about freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so on and so forth. And the governments, their provincial governments, have ordered them back to work or go to jail. They have taken those challenges to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they have won because those things are guaranteed in the Charter of Rights. But then the government of Alberta, and it gets too complicated, and others, they can play around and pass laws, and they can overturn that. But that's another story. But that's an example of the Supreme Court and those types of things. Okay, are there any questions? Oh, I couldn't hear anyone, so I am going to go. I will do this very quickly. I don't know if it will show up or not, but I will teach provincial very quickly. Provincial, instead of MPs, it's MLAs. Instead of the House of Commons, it's the Legislative Assembly. In Edmonton, in our case, there is no Senate. Instead of the Governor General, it's the Lieutenant Governor. Instead of the Prime Minister, it's the Premier. And then the cabinets, there's different cabinets. So it's education, healthcare, so they look after provincial responsibilities. And then instead of the Supreme Court of Canada, it's called different in different provinces. Usually it's referred to as the Provincial Supreme Court. I can't spell it all today. And the numbers will change. In Alberta, instead of 338 MPs, we have like 83 or 89, I can't remember, MLAs and so on and so forth. We divide the province into constituencies or ridings. Again, same thing based on population. And so it goes through, and there you go. That is the provincial government. It's basically name changes, not go to position, and that's it. Okay, and different public services and stuff like that. Okay, last thing I'm going to show you today is one that gets confusing, and it's in your retrieval chart, and it talks about you. It gives you all kinds of statistics and things like that, and some people get confused with it, and it's actually not that complicated. You're going to look at it and go, well, that's kind of weird. But I'm going to show you where you have a majority government and majority rules, but that's actually not true. Okay, usually the majority never rules in Canada. The majority's voice is actually second, but that's kind of different. So we have in Canada what's called a first past the post system. That's actually a horse racing term, where the first jockey and horse across the post, the finish line, won the race. Well, that's how we set up our government system. So again, I'll just use the federal system. It's the same provincially. Now we have 338 ridings across Canada. We live in the Livingston-Macleod or Macleod riding. So I'll do very simple, and I'll keep the numbers simple as well. This is the Macleod riding. And then I'm going to pick one out in BC. We're going to call it the Island, what do I want to call it? BC Island Northeast. I just made that up. Okay? So, McLeod riding, we go in, we vote federally, and we're going to give it to the Conservatives, and they're going to get 10,000 votes. Okay? Next, we have the Liberals that end up with 9,000 votes, and then we have the NDP that end up with 5,000 votes. That's the results of our election in this one of 338 ridings. Who gets the seat and goes to Ottawa to represent the McLeod riding? Well, Conservatives have the most votes. They're first past the post. Boom. So cons equal 1 MP. Okay, next, let's go to Vancouver. Why did I put V.C? Anyways, Vancouver. Next, very different situation, different people out there. Okay, same thing, 10,000 votes, 9,000 votes. What are the chances? 5,000 votes. So this time, the NDP ended up with 10,000. Liberals lost out again. A close second at 9,000, and this time the cons did not do so well. 5,000. Okay, who gets the vote? So NDP equals 1 MP. And this is essentially what they do across the entire province or country on election night. They have to count the leaders in each riding. The person with the most votes in some of these ridings, I actually was in a federal riding in Edmonton when I was going to university in the early 90s, won originally by 1 vote. I kid you not. They did a recount, and then it was by 12 votes, and this before election machines and stuff like that. But either way, some of these ridings are very, very close. At the end of the day, though, even if it's 1 vote difference, that's it. Never underestimate the power of 1 vote. 1 vote gave Hitler the leadership of the Nazi Party. 1 vote made English over German the official language of the United States. Look it up. I don't make this stuff up. History's crazy. So we know who the people are. Now what I want to do is show you the popular vote. And you'll see this all the time. This came up in US elections too. Okay? So this is overall. So at the end, if we take all 338 ridings, not manipulating it and just taking 2, I'm just doing this for an example, and we add up the total amount of people that vote in the entire country. So I kept these numbers nice and neat to make it simple. Conservatives had 10,000 votes here and 5,000 votes here. So this is the popular vote. This is overall. So cons end up with 15,000 people who voted for him. And again, just in 2 ridings, but we would do this for 338, but I would be too tired to write all of that out. Next, let's go to the NDP. They were successful here, 10,000 and 5,000. They also ended up with 15,000. Again, I kept the numbers nice and simple. Let's go to the Liberals, 9,000 and 9,000. Oh, wait a minute. I know I'm a social teacher, but look at the math. The Liberals end up with 18,000 votes. So in effect, more people in popular vote voted for Liberals than they did for the NDP or the Conservatives. Okay, so that's interesting. This is one of the systems. Is it flawed? Well, that depends on your take, and I guess sometimes people change their minds based on who's in power. Bottom line is, we're just using this as 2 examples. This can actually happen federally when you add things up. It happens in the US system as well. I'm not going to get into the US system today. So for example, Mr. Trump in his last election, okay, more people actually voted for Hillary Clinton more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton than they actually did Donald Trump. However, he became the president. Their system's different, college electoral and stuff like that, but and so you would have seen a lot of that on the news perhaps. And so I'm using that as an example. And when you read your stuff in the election results in the retrieval chart, you're going to see things like that. And so what some people in a system Sweden does, for example, is they do what's called proportional representation. Basically, they assign seats and then they adjust and they have extras, if you will, to recognize the popular vote. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening a lot of the time, the majority of the time, is that you will get governments that are majority governments, and they will have less than 50% of people that actually voted for them. But they just happen to finish first in more ridings than other people. So, for example, some of the liberal governments under Jean Chrétien in the early 90s, they would have fairly large majority governments running 180 odd seats out of the 338, yet 42% of the Canadians voted for them. But they got the most votes. Another really good example is when Mr. Klein, Ralph Klein, was Premier of Alberta. He would have massive majority governments because they're very conservative here in Alberta. And so more people would vote conservative overall. Well, no, they wouldn't vote conservative overall. But he had massive majorities where he would have, like, out of 82 seats, he'd have 80 of them. But there were times where there are 50 or 55% of people, or even less, voted for him. And so you can Google and look up all those statistics, and that's where the popular vote comes in. And so some people have really looked at our system and said, is that flawed? Others have said, hey, if this is who we want in Macleod, then give it to us. This is who we want in BC Island Northeast, and that's who we get. We don't care about the population overall. Others say, wait a minute, this is a democracy, majority rules. And so it becomes very complex. But in the end, what ends up happening, and you'll hear the term a lot, is vote splitting. And this is the fear of some UCP members currently in Alberta. There's a real divide even within the UCP of supporting Jason Kenney as their leader. And so some people have talked about separation. There's the Wexit Party. They've talked about the reemergence of the Wild Rose Party, and so on and so forth. And they said, we've got to stick together. We are the United Conservative Party. And that's the whole reason for the United Conservative Party, is because in the last election, not the last one, but the one before, where the NDP came to power, what ended up happening, I'm going to show you this quickly, is we go to our spectrum. So if we look at our political spectrum, and that's a mini version in the center, we had the Wild Rose, we had the Conservatives, and then we could debate, but the NDP is really a centrist party. And then we have Liberals and Greens and stuff like that. So basically there were two types of people. Those around the center, the NDP in Alberta are actually Liberal, and those that are right-wing thinking. Okay, and what ended up happening is that you had a chunk of people that voted here, and then people that were right-wing had two choices. And remember, we have our value systems going down like this. So people that leaned right had two choices versus people that are center to left had one choice. So all the people center or left, NDP. All the people right, Wild Rose, Conservative, I don't know. And so what ends up happening in the end is they vote both, and then it splits the vote. This one gets more seats, they win. So after that election where the NDP got in, the people that are right-wing ideology conservatives, because Wild Rose are conservative ideology, they got together and said, we can't afford to have this happen again. We've got the same values, we're in the same general area. Not true, Wild Rose is more to the right, but they're in the same general area, we could argue. And so we have to unite. We're all conservatives here. Let's take the Wild Rose, let's take the Conservative, and let's unite them and have the United Conservative Party, and that's what happened. Now there's talk of splitting again. This has gone on throughout history, even federally. You have the Conservative Party of Canada has changed names multiple times. Stephen Harper was part of the Reform Party. That was a right-wing party out of Alberta in the 1980s under Preston Manning that pushed for a Triple E Senate. Eventually, the Reform Party was the same thing, and the Conservatives, they said, well, you need to unite the right. And actually, at first, here was their first one, the Canadian Right Alliance Party. That's what they were going to call it. And then they said, yeah, that's not going to work. And so eventually it became just the Conservative Party. And I know you can't read my messy writing there now. In the past, when I was a kid growing up, it was the Progressive Conservative Party, which is two oxymorons contradicting terms together. But again, that's a history. So throughout history, federally and certainly provincially in Alberta, there's been an idea of uniting the right. And part of the reason is most people actually tend to be around the center, maybe a little bit to the right. And so, in order to, when you start to go this far right, if there's too many options, because this can vary in degrees, it starts to split the vote. And that's what we have there. Okay, I think I've covered my objectives. So you have a basic understanding of the structure of Canadian government. And hopefully, when you see all those election results and you see the percentage of the vote, and then first past the post and what's going on, my little simplistic diagrams will help with that. All right, well, have a good day. Good luck. And remember, it's Friday. That's crazy. We've got 1 week left. So if you're behind on any assignments, and some of you have talked to me and had some legitimate reasons, well, let's get her all done this weekend. We have to. And we got to start fresh on Monday. Have a great day.